Alistair took Tamson's hand at the altar because she came with a dowry of 300 spears and a valley of silver mines. He didn't look at her twin sister Tess standing in the shadows of the damp stone chapel. Tess was considered defective, a wolf who hadn't shifted in 5 years. She was invisible until dawn broke, bringing the heavy, earth-shaking tread of the Alpha King's vanguard to their gates, and a monarch who saw exactly what Alistair had thrown away. The great hall of Dunlock stank of roasted pork, spilled ale, and damp fur. Tess sat at the far end of the lowest table, her back pressed against the draughty stone wall. Above her on the raised dais, the wedding feast raged. Her twin sister Tamson sat beside Lord Alistair. They looked like a matched set of freshly minted coins. Tamson wore crimson wool embroidered with gold thread, her dark hair braided tight against her scalp in the style of a warrior bride. Alistair wore the heavy iron circlet of the regional Alpha. He was laughing at something Tamson had just whispered in his ear, his hand resting possessively on her thigh. Tess watched them with a dull, hollow ache in her chest. She took a sip of her watered-down wine. It tasted like vinegar. They shared the same face, Tess and Tamson. The same sharp jawline, the same pale grey eyes, the same shock of dark hair. But that was where the similarities ended. Tamson was a conqueror. She had spent her youth sparring with the guards in the mud, mastering the broadsword, and learning the brutal arithmetic of pack politics. She understood that in a world ruled by fangs and winter storms, power was the only currency that mattered. Tess was a manager of mundane survivals. She knew how much grain the keep needed to survive until the spring thaw. She knew how to pack a wound with yarrow to stop the bleeding. She knew the names of the scullery maids and the blacksmith's apprentices. To the people of Dunlock, Tess was a necessity. To Lord Alistair, she was irrelevant. It hadn't always been that way. 2 summers ago, when Alistair was just the second son of a dying lord, he used to meet Tess by the river. He used to press her against the rough bark of the willow trees and swear that her quiet strength was what the pack needed. He liked her hands, he said. He liked that they weren't always curled into fists. Then his older brother died in a border skirmish. Then his father succumbed to a winter fever. Alistair became the Alpha of Dunlock, and the romantic promises of a second son evaporated under the crushing weight of a lord's reality. He needed an alliance. He needed the loyalty of the standing army. Tamson commanded the respect of the vanguard. Tess commanded the loyalty of the cooks. The math was simple. "You shouldn't stare, my lady." Tess blinked, pulling her gaze away from the high table. Bran, the aging pack healer, slid onto the wooden bench beside her. He carried 2 fresh cups of ale and set one in front of her. His joints popped as he sat. "I'm not staring," Tess said. Her voice was flat. "I'm observing. Observing is just staring with an excuse." Bran grunted, taking a long pull from his cup. "It's done. They've bled over the altar. They've shared the meat. By midnight they'll be bedding down. Torturing yourself won't unwed them. I'm not tortured, Bran. I'm practical." Tess wrapped her fingers around the cold clay cup. Alistair made a tactical choice. Tamson brings him the military backing he needs to secure the northern ridge. If he had chosen me, the vanguard would have rioted. He would have been challenged for the Alpha position within a month. Bran looked at her sideways, his bushy grey eyebrows furrowing. "You have a terrible habit of justifying the people who hurt you. It's not justification, it's just gravity. A rock falls because it's heavy, not because it hates the sky." Tess looked back at the dais. Alistair was standing now, raising his goblet to the roaring crowd. The firelight caught the sharp angles of his face. He looked regal. He looked perfectly suited to the brutal world he inhabited. For a brief, humiliating second, his eyes met hers across the smoky expanse of the hall. The smile faltered on his lips. A flicker of something, guilt maybe, or regret passed over his features. Tess didn't look away. She raised her clay cup to him, a silent, cynical toast. "You bought your peace, Alistair. I hope you survived the price." He broke the gaze, first turning back to his new bride. Tamson hadn't missed the exchange. She looked down at Tess, her grey eyes narrowing slightly. There was no malice in Tamson's look, only a cold, predatory assessment. Tamson didn't hate Tess. Tamson simply viewed her the way a wolf views a broken branch on the trail, an obstacle to be stepped over and forgotten. Tess stood up. The bench scraped loudly against the flagstones, but the noise was swallowed by the drunken singing of the pack. "Where are you going?" Bran asked. "To check the root cellars." Tess lied. "I think the damp is getting to the winter squash." She didn't wait for his reply. She turned her back on the heat, the noise, and the man who had traded her for an army and walked out into the freezing night. The courtyard was deserted, save for a few drunken guards snoring near the stables. The air was sharp and biting thick with the scent of pine and coming snow. Tess pulled her thin woolen shawl tighter around her shoulders. She walked until she reached the outer wall, climbing the stone steps to the parapet. She leaned against the freezing stone and looked out over the valley. The world was dark and vast. She closed her eyes and tried to summon her wolf. She dug deep into her chest, looking for that primal spark, the beast that was supposed to share her soul. Nothing. Just the empty, hollow quiet that had been there for 5 years. Since she was 18, the wolf had gone silent. It hadn't died. She would have felt the agonizing tear in her soul if it had, but it had retreated into some deep, inaccessible cavern of her mind, refusing to come out. A wolf who could not shift was a liability, a broken thing. It was the unspoken reason Alistair had found it so easy to walk away. Tess exhaled, watching her breath plume in the frigid air. She didn't cry. Tears were a waste of hydration. Tomorrow the keep would need cleaning. The ledgers would need balancing. The winter was coming, and survival cared nothing for a broken heart. Dawn in Dunlock was a brutal affair. It didn't arrive with a gentle lightening of the sky, but with a harsh grey scrape against the horizon. Tess was already awake, her hands buried in the warm, soapy water of a wash bucket in the scullery. The keep was suffering a collective, agonizing hangover. The servants moved sluggishly, muttering curses under their breath as they swept away gnawed bones and mopped up puddles of stale ale. "Put more sand on those bloodstains by the hearth." Tess instructed a young kitchen boy who was leaning heavily on his broom. "If it sets into the stone, we'll be smelling iron until midsummer." She wrung out a rag and wiped her brow. Her back ached from sleeping on a lumpy pallet in the servants' quarters. She had vacated her room in the family wing to make space for Alistair's visiting commanders. She didn't mind. The servants' quarters were warmer, tucked above the kitchens, and the company was significantly less treacherous. Suddenly the heavy oak doors of the kitchen flew open. Marta, the head cook, stood in the frame, gasping for air. Her broad face was flushed purple. "Riders!" she wheezed, clutching the doorframe. "Banners on the south ridge." Tess frowned, dropping the rag back into the bucket. "Alistair's southern patrols aren't due back for a week. Are they mercenaries?" "No." Marta swallowed hard, her eyes wide with a terror that made the hair on Tess's arms stand up. "It's the Black Wolf on a field of iron grey. It's the king." The kitchen went dead silent. The boy dropped his broom. It clattered loudly against the floorboards. King Torin. He was a myth that bled. He had spent the last decade tearing through the fragmented territories of the continent, uniting the warring packs not through diplomacy, but through sheer, overwhelming dominance. He didn't ask for fealty. He extracted it. Rumours said he was a savage, a man who preferred the company of his warhounds to his courtiers. He hadn't visited the Northern Territories in 5 years. "Why is he here?" Tess asked, wiping her hands on her apron. Her mind was already racing. calculating food stores, estimating how many men he travelled with, wondering if they had enough hay for the horses. "Does it matter?" Marta snapped, finally recovering her breath. "He's an hour away. Lord Alistister is still in bed with your sister. Someone needs to wake them before the king burns the gates down for making him wait." Tess untied her apron. "I'll do it." She bypassed the great hall and took the servants' stairs 2 at a time. The stone was freezing under her thin leather shoes. She reached the Alpha's wing and pushed past a sleepy, confused guard who didn't have the reflexes to stop her. She pounded her fist against the heavy timber door of the master chamber. "Alistair Tamson, wake up." Silence. She hit the wood harder, her knuckles barking against the iron studs. "Alistair, get out of bed. The king is on the south ridge." There was a sudden violent crash from inside the room. A string of vicious curses followed in Alistair's voice. The door wrenched open. Alistair stood there, his hair wild, a hastily tied fur mantle thrown over his naked shoulders. He smelled of sweat sex and panic. "What did you say?" he demanded, his voice thick with sleep. "King Torin," Tess said, keeping her face perfectly blank, ignoring the dishevelled sight of Tamson sitting up in the bed behind him, pulling a sheet over her chest. "His banners are an hour from the gates. You need to dress. The courtyard is a mess, and the guards are mostly drunk or unconscious." Alistair's face drained of colour. The political mastermind vanished, replaced by a terrified young lord who suddenly realised a predator was walking into his den. He wasn't scheduled to tour the north until spring. Why now? Was it a summons? Did we miss a raven? "I don't know, Alistair. I manage the root cellars, not your correspondence," Tess said evenly. "Get dressed. Send Tamson to rouse the vanguard. They need to look like a standing army, not a pile of corpses." Tamson was already out of bed, shivering in the cold air, pulling a heavy tunic over her head. "Tess is right," Tamson said, her voice sharp and commanding, the military leader instantly returning. "I'll get the men to the courtyard. Alistair, put on your armour. Not the ceremonial plate, the scarred leather. You want him to think you're a fighter, not a peacock." Tess watched them scramble, a perfectly matched pair in their ambition and their fear. She turned and walked away. There was water to boil, meat to thaw, and a keep to prepare. By the time the horns sounded at the outer gates, Dunlock had managed to scrape together a facade of readiness. 50 guards stood at attention in the muddy courtyard, their spears held straight. Alistair stood at the head of the formation, looking grim and authoritative. Tamson stood at his right, wearing boiled leather armour over a grey wool dress, looking every inch the fierce alpha female. Tess stood near the back, standing with Marta and the senior servants. She wore her simple brown wool dress, her hair tied back in a fraying leather cord. She was invisible, exactly where she wanted to be. The massive iron gates groaned open. The first thing that hit the courtyard was the smell. It was wild. It smelled of lightning-crushed pine needles and ozone. It was a scent so heavy it felt like physical pressure pushing down on the chest. Several of the guards shifted uncomfortably. Tess felt a strange, jarring twitch in her chest, a deep, buried flutter. She ignored it. The vanguard rode in. 10 massive men on heavy war horses wearing dark chainmail and carrying themselves with a terrifying, loose-limbed stillness. They didn't look around. They didn't posture. They were completely secure in their lethality. Then the king rode through the gates. Torin was not what the songs claimed. He wasn't a mountain of muscle dripping in gold. He was tall, yes, broad-shouldered and lean, but there was nothing ostentatious about him. He rode a massive roan gelding dressed in a faded black travelling cloak and battered leather armour. His hair was dark and cut brutally short, his jaw shadowed by a few days of stubble. He looked exhausted. He looked like a man who carried a mountain on his back and was tired of the weight. But his eyes, when he stopped his horse in the centre of the courtyard and looked down at Alistair, Tess saw his eyes. They were a vivid, terrifying amber. the colour of a forest fire. They missed nothing. Alistair stepped forward, forcing his shoulders back. He bowed deeply. Tamson followed suit. "My king." Alistair said, his voice echoing loudly in the silent courtyard. "Dunlock welcomes you. Had we known of your arrival, we would have prepared a feast worthy of your station." Torin stared at him for a agonizing moment. He didn't dismount immediately. He simply sat in the saddle looking at Alistair, the way a man looks at a particularly uninteresting bug. "I don't need a feast, Lord Alistair," Torin said. His voice was a low, gravelly rumble. It didn't echo, but it carried effortlessly, slipping into the ears of every person in the courtyard. "I need fresh horses, and I need to know why your southern border patrols have been missing their check-ins at the river crossing for the last 2 moons. Alistair swallowed hard. "My king, the winter preparations. I am not interested in your excuses." Torin interrupted, smoothly swinging his leg over the saddle and dropping to the muddy ground. He stood a full head taller than Alistair. "We will speak of it inside, out of the wind." He tossed his reins to a waiting guardsman and began walking toward the great hall. He didn't wait to see if Alistair followed. He simply assumed the world would arrange itself around his movements, and it did. Alistair and Tamson hurried after him, trailing in his wake like anxious children. The royal vanguard dismounted, moving to secure the courtyard. Tess let out a long, slow breath. The king was here. The dynamic of the entire region was about to fracture. She turned to Marta. "Get the salted beef boiling, and double the rations of ale for his men. A sober vanguard is a bored vanguard, and bored men break things." Marta nodded frantically and scurried towards the kitchens. Tess began to follow her, intending to bury herself in the pantry until the king and his terrifying amber eyes left Dunlock forever. But as she took a step toward the servants' entrance, the scent hit her again. Closer this time. Lightning and pine. She froze. The great hall had been transformed. The remnants of the wedding feast had been hastily scrubbed away, the long tables pushed back to make room. The hearth fires roared, casting flickering shadows against the high stone ceiling. Torin sat at the center of the high table in the heavy oak chair that belonged to the Alpha of Dunlock. He hadn't asked to sit there. He simply took it. Alistair stood to the side, looking displaced in his own hall. Tamson stood beside her husband, her spine rigidly straight, projecting an air of unbothered strength. Tess stood in the shadows near the entrance to the kitchens, holding a heavy silver pitcher of mulled wine. She was supposed to hand it off to one of the younger serving girls, but her feet felt rooted to the floor. The strange, erratic thumping in her chest had returned. It felt like a trapped bird battering against her ribs. "Stop it," she told herself firmly. "It's just anxiety. It's just a man. Your ledgers show a surplus of iron ore from the valley mines." Torin was saying, his voice a low hum that vibrated through the floorboards. He was staring at a piece of parchment unrolled on the table before him. He hadn't touched the food or drink set out for him. "Yet your tax shipment to the capital was 20% light this autumn. Explain the discrepancy." Alistair cleared his throat, a nervous, raspy sound. "The roads, my king. The early mudslides in the pass made transport difficult. We prioritized sending grain." Torin slowly looked up from the parchment. He didn't yell. He didn't bare his teeth. The danger was entirely in his stillness. "Mudslides. Strange. My vanguard rode through the pass 3 days ago. The ground is frozen solid. Has been for a month." Alistair's jaw tightened. "Perhaps a miscalculation on my quartermaster's part, sire. I will have him flogged." "Don't deflect your incompetence onto your subordinates, Alistair," Torin said softly. "It is unseemly. You kept the iron to forge new weapons, 300 spears, I believe." Torin's amber eyes flicked toward Tamson. A dowry requirement, was it not? Tamson didn't flinch. She met the king's gaze squarely. A pack must defend itself, Your Grace. A strong northern border serves the crown. Torin tilted his head, regarding Tamson with mild curiosity. You are the new bride. Tamson. I am my king. You have a reputation. Torin said, leaning back in the carved chair. They say you are ruthless, that you command the vanguard better than the men you replaced. Tamson offered a tight, proud smile. I do what is necessary for my people. And you— Torin looked back at Alistister, his voice dripping with sudden, heavy contempt. You traded your loyalty and your taxes to buy a weapon to sleep next to. You thought marrying the commander of your army would secure your seat against your rivals. Alistister looked frantic now. My king, my loyalty to the crown is absolute. This marriage was— Torin raised a single scarred hand. Alistair's jaw snapped shut. The silence in the hall was absolute. The crackle of the hearth-fire sounded like breaking bones. I do not care who you bed, Alistister, Torin said, the boredom returning to his tone. I care about my iron. I care about my borders. You will have the missing shipments loaded on wagons by dusk. You will send 50 of your newly armed men south to join my standing army at the capital as a penalty for your lie. Do you understand? Yes, my king, Alistister said quickly. Too quickly. The relief of escaping with only a fine and a draft was palpable in his posture. Tamson looked angry at the loss of her men, but she had the political sense to remain quiet. Torin sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. He looked incredibly weary. Bring me wine, he muttered. The serving girl next to Tess squeaked in terror, thrusting a wooden cup into Tess's hands. You do it, the girl hissed, stepping back into the shadows. He'll bite my head off. Tess scowled at the girl, but there was no time to argue. She balanced the heavy silver pitcher in one hand and the wooden cup in the other. She stepped out of the shadows. She kept her head down, her eyes fixed on the flagstones. She walked the length of the hall with the practiced, invisible glide of a veteran servant. She didn't look at Alistister. She didn't look at Tamson. She approached the high table from the side. She set the wooden cup down near Torin's right hand and began to pour the mulled wine. The steam rose, smelling of cloves, cinnamon, and cheap red vintage. Torin didn't look at her. He was staring at the parchment again. Tess finished pouring. She took a step back, preparing to fade back into the stone walls. Then Torin inhaled. It was a sharp, sudden sound, like a man breaking the surface of water after being submerged too long. He stopped moving. His hand, which had been reaching for the cup, froze mid-air. Tess froze too. The thumping in her chest exploded into a frantic, bruising rhythm. The scent of lightning and pine intensified until she felt dizzy. Her dormant wolf, the silent, broken thing inside her, suddenly thrashed violently against its cage, howling into the dark of her mind. No, Tess thought wildly. No, no, no. Torin turned his head slowly. The weariness was gone from his posture. Every muscle in his massive frame was coiled tight as a bowstring. He looked up at her. Tess looked back. She couldn't help it. His eyes caught hers, and the air vanished from her lungs. Up close, the amber in his irises was threaded with flecks of gold. They were the eyes of an ancient, starving thing. What is your name? Torin asked. His voice was different now. The gravelly rumble had smoothed out into a dark, resonant hum that made the fine hairs on the back of Tess's neck stand up. Alistister stepped forward, eager to intervene. That is merely a servant, my king. If the wine is sour, I asked her. Torin snarled without breaking eye contact with Tess. The sheer concussive force of the alpha command in his voice hit the room like a physical blow. Alistister stumbled backward, his hands flying up defensively. Tamson grabbed the edge of the table, her face pale. Tess forced her chin up. She refused to tremble. She was a realist. Panic achieved nothing. "My name is Tess," she said. Her voice was steady, though her hands gripped the handle of the silver pitcher tight enough to turn her knuckles white. Torin's eyes tracked the movement. He looked at her rough, work-reddened hands. He looked at the frayed leather cord binding her hair. He looked at the plain brown wool of her dress. Then he stood up. The chair scraped loudly as he pushed it back. He towered over her. The sheer physical presence of him was overwhelming. He stepped around the heavy oak table, closing the distance between them until he was barely an arm's length away. Tess stood her ground. She didn't lower her gaze. Torin leaned down slightly. He inhaled again slowly, right at the curve of her neck. A full body shiver wrecked through Tess, completely involuntary. "You smell of ash and root vegetables," Torin murmured, his voice pitched so low only she could hear it. "I manage the kitchens, my lord." Tess managed to say, her throat tight. "You smell of winter," he continued, as if she hadn't spoken. He brought her hand up. His fingers were scarred, the calluses thick. He gently brushed the side of her neck just below her jawline. The contact sent a shock of heat straight down to her toes. And underneath that, "You smell like mine." The words hung in the air, heavy and impossible. Alistister made a choked sound in the background. "My king, sire, you are mistaken. That is Tess, Tamson's twin. She is defective. She hasn't shifted since she was a pup. She is worthless to a pack." Torin finally pulled his gaze away from Tess. He turned his head slightly to look at Alistister. The fury on the king's face was so cold, so absolute, it stripped the air from the room. "Worthless," Torin repeated, testing the word. "She has no political standing." Tamson added her voice tight, trying to salvage the situation, trying to understand the catastrophic shift in power occurring before her eyes. "She commands no one, Your Grace." Torin turned back to Tess. He didn't look disgusted by her plainness. He looked like a man who had spent a decade searching in the mud and had finally found a flawless diamond. "She commands me," Torin stated. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. It was a fact as undeniable as gravity. He reached out and took the heavy silver pitcher from Tess's shaking hand. He set it on the table. Then he laced his fingers through hers. His hand was impossibly warm. "Pack your things, Tess," the Alpha King commanded, his amber eyes burning into hers. "You leave for the capital with me at dawn." Tess owned very little. When the king of the continent tells you to pack your life, the actual physical task is embarrassingly brief. She stood in the center of the cramped servants' quarters, staring at the small canvas sack on her lumpy cot. Inside were the sum total of her 23 years on Earth. 2 heavy wool winter dresses mended at the elbows. A pair of sturdy leather boots freshly oiled to repel the snow. A bone-handled skinning knife inherited from her mother. 3 pouches of dried herbs for headaches and joint pain. A small, worn ledger containing her own personal tallies of Dunlock stores. That was it. She didn't own jewelry. She didn't own silk. The heavy wooden door creaked open, scraping against the uneven floorboards. Tamson stood in the threshold. She had changed out of her ceremonial armor and wore a deep green velvet gown that caught the sparse morning light. She looked every inch the lady of Dunlock. "The king's men are saddling the horses in the courtyard," Tamson said. She didn't cross the room. She leaned against the doorframe, her grey eyes studying Tess with a cold, calculating curiosity. "I'll be down in 5 minutes," Tess replied, pulling the drawstring of her sack tight. "A mate bond." Tamson said the words like they were a puzzle she couldn't quite solve. "With a defective. The moon goddess has a twisted sense of humor." "Gravity," Tess murmured. Things fall where they fall. Tamson finally stepped into the room. The scent of her expensive rose oil and alpha dominance clashed violently with the smell of old straw and lye soap in the quarters. "Listen to me, Tess. Torin is ruthless, but he is a man, and men get bored. When the novelty of this biological anomaly wears off, you will need leverage to survive in the capital. He is walking into a viper's nest of southern alphas who want his throne, and you want me to be your spy." Tess said flatly. She slung the canvas bag over her shoulder. "I want you to remember your blood." Tamson corrected, her voice hardening. "Alistister offended him today. Dunlock is on a precipice. If you have the king's ear, you can ensure our tax levies remain low. You can secure our borders." Tess looked at her twin. They shared the same face, but Tess felt like she was looking at a stranger through thick glass. Tamson didn't care about Tess's safety. Tamson cared about the iron mines. Tamson cared about power. "Yesterday I was a broken branch in your path," Tess said, stepping past her sister toward the door. "Today you want me to be a bridge. You can't have it both ways, Tamson. I am trying to keep you alive." Tamson snapped, dropping the stoic facade for a fraction of a second. Tess paused in the hallway. "No, you're trying to keep Dunlock relevant. I will survive the capital the same way I survived this place, by being useful and by expecting absolutely nothing." She left Tamson standing in the drafty room and walked down the spiraling stone stairs for the last time. Alistister was waiting at the bottom. He looked terrible. The confident golden alpha from the wedding feast was gone, replaced by a man acutely aware that he had just insulted the most dangerous predator on the continent. When he saw Tess, he took a step forward, his hands twitching at his sides. "Tess!" His voice was a strained whisper. She didn't stop walking. "Lord Alistister, excuse me, I have a horse to catch." He grabbed her arm, not hard but firmly enough to halt her momentum. "Tess, please, you have to understand, I didn't know. If I had known the king..." "If you had known the king was going to claim me, you would have treated me better." Tess finished for him. She looked down at his hand on her arm until he flushed and let go. "That is a terrible defense, Alistister. I loved you." He blurted out the words, desperate and ugly. "I did. 2 summers ago by the river." That was real. Tess felt a brief, phantom ache in her chest, the ghost of a girl who had once believed in second sons. But she was a manager of logistics now. She dealt in facts. "No, you loved the idea of a quiet life," Tess said evenly. "But you chose the crown. You chose the army. You made a tactical decision, and I respected it. Don't ruin it now by pretending it was a tragedy." She walked out into the courtyard. The morning air was freezing the sky a bruised, heavy grey. The vanguard was mounted. Torin sat on his massive roan gelding talking quietly with the lieutenant. When the heavy iron doors clattered shut behind Tess, the king stopped speaking. His amber eyes locked onto her. The physical pull of the bond was undeniable. It felt like an invisible heated tether wrapped around her ribs, pulling her forward. Tess fought the urge to rush to him. She forced her steps to remain measured, steady, and calm. Torin guided his horse toward her. He didn't offer a dramatic speech. He didn't demand the courtyard bow to his new mate. He simply looked down at the single canvas sack over her shoulder. "Is that all?" he asked. "It is." Torin nodded once. He gestured to a sturdy, calm-looking grey mare held by one of his guards. "Her name is Flint. She won't throw you if a rabbit jumps out of the brush." "I know how to ride, your grace," Tess said, moving toward the mare. "Torin?" He corrected his voice, a low rumble. "My name is Torin." Tess didn't reply. She secured her sack to the saddle horn and swung herself up onto the mare. She didn't look back at the keep. She didn't look at Alistister or Tamson standing in the archway. She set her eyes on the open gates and the brutal frozen road beyond. The King's Road was not a road at all. It was a rutted, frozen scar carved through the ancient pine forests of the Northern Territories. They rode hard. Torin's vanguard did not travel like a royal procession. They travelled like a war band. There were no supply wagons, no pavilions, no trailing servants. They ate dried meat in the saddle and stopped only when the horses began to lather in the freezing air. Tess kept pace. Her thighs screamed in agony, the muscles cramping from the relentless rhythm of the ride. But she locked her jaw and stayed silent. She was acutely aware of the vanguard watching her. 10 hardened killers shifting their gaze from the tree line to the small plain woman riding beside their king. They expected her to break. They expected tears, complaints about the cold, pleas for rest. She gave them nothing. When they stopped to water the horses at a half-frozen stream, Tess was the first out of the saddle. She didn't wait for a guard to help her. She took Flint's reins, broke the ice on the stream bank with the heel of her boot, and let the mare drink. She felt the heat of Torin's gaze on her constantly. It was a heavy physical weight, yet he kept his distance. He didn't crowd her. He rode beside her, a massive wall of dark leather and quiet authority blocking the worst of the biting wind. Night fell like a black curtain. They made camp in a sheltered ravine beneath an outcropping of grey rock. The vanguard moved with terrifying efficiency, establishing a perimeter gathering deadwood and striking fires. Tess sat on a fallen log near the edge of the firelight. She was shivering, the cold having seeped deep into her bones. She rubbed her stiff hands together, watching the men. A shadow fell over her. Torin stood there holding a battered tin cup and a thick woolen blanket. He draped the blanket over her shoulders. It smelled of him, that intoxicating, dizzying blend of ozone pine and raw power. Her traitorous lungs hitched. He handed her the cup. "Drink. It's bone broth. It will warm your core faster than the fire." "Thank you," she muttered, wrapping her numb fingers around the hot tin. The broth was rich and salty. It tasted like salvation. Torin didn't walk away. He sat down on the log beside her. He was too large for the space. His shoulder brushed against hers. The heat radiating off him was immense. For a long time, the only sound was the crackle of the fire and the wind howling through the upper canopy of the pines. "You haven't spoken a word since we left Dunlock," Torin finally said. He was staring into the flames, his profile sharp and illuminated. "I haven't had anything to say. Most women dragged from their homes by a foreign alpha would have plenty to say. Screaming mostly, or bargaining." Tess took another sip of the broth. "I am a pragmatist, Torin. Screaming uses energy. Bargaining requires leverage. I have neither." He turned his head to look at her. The golden flecks in his amber eyes caught the firelight. "You think you have no leverage, you are my mate." The word felt heavy and dangerous in the cold air. Tess looked down at the dirt. "For now," she said quietly. Torin went entirely still. The air pressure in the ravine seemed to drop. A few of the vanguard soldiers near the fire stopped talking, their heads swiveling toward the king, sensing the sudden shift in his aura. "Explain that," Torin demanded, his voice a lethal, quiet whisper. Tess forced herself to meet his gaze. If he was going to kill her or discard her, she wanted it done now, before she accidentally let herself hope. "The mate bond is biological," Tess said, keeping her voice clinically detached. "It is the wolf calling to the wolf. But my wolf is gone, Torin. It hasn't spoken to me, hasn't shifted, hasn't so much as whimpered in 5 years. I am a half measure. I am broken. When the initial shock of the scent wears off, your beast will realize there is nothing inside me answering back. The bond will sever, and you will be left with a scullery manager from the north." She waited for the disgust. She waited for him to realize Alistister had been right. Torin stared at her. His expression didn't change. He didn't look repulsed. He looked furiously, profoundly insulted. He leaned in his face inches from hers. The scent of lightning wrapped around her throat, choking off her breath. "Do you think I am a slave to an animal's instinct?" He growled. "Do you think I conquered a continent because my wolf told me to?" Tess swallowed hard. "No, I didn't claim a wolf." Torin said his words precise and heavy as iron anvils. "I claimed the woman who looked at a warlord in her hall and didn't flinch. I claimed the woman who manages the rot and the rust while the rest of the world plays at politics. You think you are broken because you cannot turn into a beast good. I have enough beasts in my court to last a lifetime. I need a woman." He reached up his rough, scarred fingers, tracing the line of her jaw. His touch was terrifyingly gentle. "The bond will not sever," Torin promised, his thumb brushing over her lower lip. "Because I will not let it. You are mine, Tess of Dunlock. Wolf or no wolf." He stood up, then the sudden absence of his heat leaving Tess shivering. He walked back toward the center of the camp, barking an order at a lieutenant about the watch rotation. Tess sat on the log, the hot tin cup trembling in her hands. She stared into the fire, trying to rebuild the cynical walls in her mind that the Alpha King was systematically tearing down. Ethelgard was not a fairy tale castle of white stone and glass. It was a fortress forged in paranoia and war. Perched on the edge of a massive, jagged cliff overlooking the crashing grey waves of the eastern sea, the capital was a sprawling complex of black basalt and iron. The towers looked like teeth biting into the sky. It was brutal, functional, and deeply intimidating. They arrived at midday a week after leaving Dunlock. The city surrounding the fortress was massive, a teeming hive of commerce and industry. As the king's vanguard rode through the heavy iron gates of the lower city, the streets fell silent. People stopped their carts. Merchants ceased their haggling. They bowed their eyes cast downward in absolute submission. Tess rode closely behind Torin, pulling her thin wool cloak tighter against the damp sea wind. She felt the weight of 10,000 eyes on her. They were looking at the space beside the king, expecting a warrior queen in gleaming armor, a fierce alpha female to match the conqueror. Instead, they saw Tess, pale, exhausted, wearing a mended brown dress, her hair wind-blown and tangled. The disappointment in the air was palpable. The procession climbed the winding road to the upper keep. The massive oak doors of the great hall were thrown open. Hundreds of courtiers, pack alphas, and military commanders waited inside, arranged in rigid hierarchies of power. The hall itself was cavernous, lit by roaring braziers and massive chandeliers of wrought iron. Torin dismounted. He didn't wait for a groom. He tossed his reins to a guard and turned to Tess. He reached up, gripping her waist with both large hands, and lifted her from the saddle as effortlessly as if she weighed nothing. He set her on her feet, keeping one hand firmly anchored on the small of her back. It was a physical claim, a warning broadcast to every predator in the courtyard. They walked into the great hall. The silence was deafening. The gathered elite bowed deeply, but as Torin and Tess passed, Tess could hear the murmurs. Werewolf hearing was sharp, and the courtiers were barely trying to hide their shock. "That is the mate she smells like dirt. I hear she's a defective from the northern ridges. Alister's cast-off. The king's wolf must be sick. She has no aura, none." Tess kept her face perfectly blank. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but she didn't shrink. She categorized the murmurs the same way she categorized a lack of winter wheat, a problem to be noted, but not panicked over. Torin felt her stiffen. His hand on her back tightened. He didn't stop walking until he reached the raised dais at the end of the hall. There was one massive throne carved from black stone. Beside it was a smaller wooden chair, clearly brought out in a hurry. Torin didn't sit. He turned to face the assembly. The murmurs instantly died. "I have returned," Torin announced. His voice wasn't a shout, but it filled the cavernous space sliding off the stone walls. "The northern borders are secure. The tax routes are open." He stepped slightly to the side, pulling Tess forward so she stood fully in the light of the braziers. "This is Tess," he said. He didn't give her a title. He didn't justify her presence. "She is my mate. She is the Lady of Ethelgard. Her word in this keep is my word." A tall, heavily scarred man with the golden insignia of a high general stepped forward from the front row. He looked at Tess with naked contempt. "My king," the general rumbled, bowing stiffly. "We rejoice at your return, and we congratulate you on finding your companion. But the lady has no pack markings, no scent of the shift. The southern lords will view this as a vulnerability. A queen must lead the lunar hunts." Tess braced herself. This was the moment. This was where Torin would have to explain her brokenness, where he would have to defend his choice to men who only respected violence. Torin stared at the general. The terrifying stillness descended over him again. "General Kyle," Torin said softly. "Step forward." The general hesitated, then took 2 steps up the dais. "Draw your sword," Torin commanded. A collective gasp echoed through the hall. Drawing steel in the presence of the king without permission was a death sentence. Doing it on command was a test. Cale slowly drew his heavy broadsword, the steel singing in the quiet room. "Now," Torin said, his amber eyes burning. "Strike her!" Tess's breath caught. Cale froze, his eyes widening in panic. "Sire, I would never—" "Strike my mate Cale. If she is a vulnerability, test her. Cut her down!" Torin's voice dropped an octave, vibrating with lethal alpha command. "Do it." Cale didn't move. Sweat beaded on his scarred forehead. He knew it was a trap. If he swung the sword, he would be dead before the blade crossed halfway. The king's muscles were coiled, his fangs beginning to elongate past his lower lip. Torin was daring him to try. "I cannot, my king!" Kyle whispered, lowering the sword and dropping to one knee. "Why not?" Torin sneered, stepping closer to the kneeling man. "Because she is weak, or because you know that if a single hair on her head is harmed, I will peel the skin from your body and feed your pack to my hounds." The hall was dead silent. The air was thick with the scent of Kyle's terror. "She does not need to shift, General," Torin said to the entire hall, his voice echoing like thunder. "She does not need to hunt, because I am the apex predator in this kingdom, and I am her shield. Anyone who questions her worth questions my authority, and you all know how I deal with treason." Torin turned his back on the kneeling general. He looked down at Tess. His eyes softened the gold, returning to the amber. He held out his hand. Tess looked at his scarred palm. He hadn't asked her to be a warrior. He had just burned down the social hierarchy of his entire court to ensure she wouldn't have to be. She placed her hand in his. "Come," Torin said gently. "You look tired. Let's find the kitchens. You can tell me everything my quartermaster is doing wrong." Ethelgard did not function like a castle. It functioned like a poorly maintained broadsword. It was sharp at the edges and rusting at the hilt. Tess ignored the courtiers who sneered at her plain wool dresses. She ignored the whispers of the southern lords who mocked her lack of a wolf's aura. She simply went to work. She started in the kitchens. Within 3 days, she discovered the head cook was skimming a quarter of the fresh meat to sell back to the lower city merchants. She fired him, promoted a terrified but competent scullery maid, and cut the keep's food expenses by 30%. She moved to the laundries, reorganizing the boiling vats to prevent the constant outbreaks of winter rash that plagued the guard barracks. Then she found the archives. It was a damp, windowless room, beneath the western tower, smelling of mildew and rat droppings. For a week Tess sat at a rickety wooden table with a tallow candle cross-referencing the tax ledgers from the southern territories against the quartermaster's inventory. That was where she found the anomaly. Torin found her there at midnight. He filled the doorway, his massive frame blocking out the torchlight from the corridor. He wore only linen trousers and an unlaced tunic, his hair damp from the bath. He looked dangerous, relaxed, and entirely out of place in a room full of dusty paper. "My guard said you haven't eaten since noon," Torin said, stepping into the room. He carried a plate of sliced cold roast and a chunk of dark bread. He set it down on the ledger she was reading. "I was eating dust and numbers," Tess murmured, pulling the ledger out from under the plate. She didn't look up at him. "Your quartermaster is either an idiot or he is preparing for a siege." Torin pulled up a stool. It creaked dangerously under his weight. "Explain." Tess turned the ledger toward him, pointing to a column of neat, cramped handwriting with her ink-stained finger. "Lord Malcolm of the Southern Ridge sent his winter tribute last month. 300 barrels of salted pork, 50 crates of iron arrowheads, and 10 barrels of medicinal alcohol." "A standard tribute," Torin noted, tearing off a piece of the bread and handing it to her. Tess took it. She chewed, swallowed, and tapped the paper. "Yes, but look at the infirmary ledgers from the past 3 weeks. The alcohol is gone, all 10 barrels, and the quartermaster has authorized the transfer of 70 crates of bandages, yarrow, and needle thread down to the lower city barracks, the barracks that house Lord Malcolm's personal guard." Torin's amber eyes narrowed. The relaxed posture vanished. The Alpha King returned, sharp and lethal. "They are hoarding medical supplies. You only hoard bandages if you expect to bleed," Tess said quietly. She met his gaze. "And you only expect to bleed if you plan on starting a war. Look at the grain silos. Malcolm's men have been slowly shifting the dry, rot wheat to the upper keep, while moving the fresh winter wheat down to their own stores. If they lock the gates to the lower city, the upper keep starves in a month. He's not just planning a rebellion, Torin. He's planning it for this week, before the first blizzard blocks the mountain passes." Torin stared at the numbers. He didn't question her math. He didn't ask if she was sure. He simply reached across the table and took her ink-stained hand in his. His thumb brushed over her knuckles. "You found in a stack of paper what my spies couldn't find in a month of drinking with his soldiers," Torin said. His voice was a low, terrifying rumble of pride. "I manage things." Tess said, a slight flush rising to her cheeks. "Rebellions are just logistics with swords. If you choke their supplies, they can't fight." Torin stood up. The air in the room felt suddenly charged, thick with the scent of ozone and coming violence. "Then we will not wait for them to draw steel. We will bleed them tomorrow night at the feast of the winter moon." He turned to leave, but paused in the doorway. He looked back at her, his expression softening. "Come to bed, Tess. The numbers will be here tomorrow. You are my mate, not my accountant." Tess looked at the plate of cold meat, then at the king who had given her a kingdom to fix. She closed the ledger. "I'm coming." The great hall was loud, hot, and thick with tension. The Feast of the Winter Moon was a mandatory gathering of the pack alphas, a display of unity before the deep snows locked the territories apart. Tess sat to Torin's right. She wore a dress of heavy midnight blue velvet, a gift from Torin that she had reluctantly accepted. It was unadorned, lacking the gold embroidery favored by the southern ladies, but it fit her perfectly. She kept her hands folded in her lap, watching the room with the clinical detachment of a hawk. Lord Malcolm sat 3 tables away. He was a broad, bearded man with a false, booming laugh. He drank heavily, but Tess noticed he wasn't eating the meat. Torin leaned close to her ear. "My vanguard has secured the lower city gates. Malcolm's men are locked inside their barracks. Now we wait for him to realize he is deaf and blind." Tess nodded slightly. She didn't feel fear. She felt the hyper-focused clarity she used when balancing a disastrous budget. Every moving piece in the hall was accounted for, except one. A serving boy no older than 16 approached the high table, holding a heavy silver tray. He was trembling. His eyes darted nervously toward Lord Malcolm, then back to the floor. He wasn't one of the regular kitchen staff. Tess knew every face in her kitchens. The boy stepped up to the dais, reaching toward Torin's goblet with a pitcher of dark wine. "Stop," Tess said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the noise of the high table like a cracking whip. The boy froze. Torin didn't move, but his eyes locked onto the servant. General Kyle, standing behind the king's chair, put his hand on the hilt of his sword. "Pour a cup for yourself, boy," Tess commanded, keeping her gaze pinned to his pale face. "Drink it." The boy's breathing hitched. He looked at the pitcher, then at Tess. The terror in his eyes was absolute. With a sudden desperate cry, he dropped the silver tray. The clatter was deafening. He didn't run. He lunged forward, pulling a thin, jagged dagger from his sleeve, aiming straight for Torin's throat. He was fast, the frantic speed of a cornered animal. But Tess was closer. She didn't shift into a wolf. She didn't roar. She simply reacted with the brutal pragmatism of a woman who had spent her life butchering winter livestock. She reached into the folds of her velvet dress, drew the bone-handled skinning knife her mother had given her, and drove it upward into the soft tissue under the boy's armpit as he swung over the table. It was a perfectly calculated strike. The blade severed the axillary artery. The boy gasped, his eyes going wide. The dagger slipped from his fingers, clattering harmlessly against Torin's armored chest. Blood sprayed in a hot, bright arc across the white linen tablecloth. He collapsed onto the floor, choking. The hall erupted into chaos. "Treason!" General Kyle roared, drawing his broadsword. Lord Malcolm jumped to his feet, kicking his chair back. "The king is weak! Take him!" he bellowed to his hidden loyalists in the crowd. Half a dozen men drew steel and surged towards the dais. Torin didn't look at them. He looked at Tess. She was standing over the dying boy, her hands covered in blood, her face a mask of pale, terrifying calm. She wiped her knife on the tablecloth and slid it back into her dress. Torin let out a sound that shook the very foundations of Eithilgard. It was not a human yell. It was the roar of an apex predator unleashed. His bones cracked violently, his form expanding dark fur erupting across his skin. In the span of a single heartbeat, the king of wolves stood upon the dais, a massive black beast with eyes of burning amber. He launched himself off the platform. The slaughter was fast, and it was absolute. Torin did not fight like a man with a sword. He fought like a force of nature. He tore through Malcolm's loyalists, snapping spines and crushing windpipes. General Kyle and the royal vanguard joined the fray, but they were barely needed. The king was a living execution. When Torin reached Lord Malcolm, the Southern Alpha tried to shift. He was too slow. Torin's jaws clamped around Malcolm's throat, crushing the thick muscle and bone with a sickening crunch. He tossed the body aside like a broken doll. The hall fell dead silent. The remaining courtiers were pressed against the walls, trembling, the scent of urine and raw terror thick in the air. Torin stood in the center of the carnage. His muzzle was stained crimson. His massive chest heaved. The beast was fully in control, its feral instincts demanding violence. He turned slowly, his amber eyes sweeping the room, looking for another threat. He looked at the dais. Tess stood there. She wasn't cowering. She picked up a clean linen napkin and walked down the stone steps. She stepped over a dead mercenary, her velvet dress trailing in the spilled wine and blood. She walked straight up to the massive black wolf. General Kale hissed a warning, but she ignored him. Tess stopped inches from Torin's bloody jaws. The beast bared its fangs, a low growl vibrating in its throat. It didn't recognize a queen. It only recognized prey. "Stop it," Tess said flatly. She reached out and placed her small, blood-stained hand flat against the wolf's massive snout. "The math is done, Torin. The threat is handled. Shift back. You're ruining my floors." The beast froze. The scent of her ozone pine and the coppery tang of fresh blood hit him. The amber eyes blinked. The feral rage slowly receded, replaced by the crushing gravity of the mate bond. Torin's form blurred. The fur melted away, bones snapping back into human alignment. He stood before her, naked, covered in gore, breathing heavily. He looked at the dead boy on the dais. He looked at the knife hidden in her dress. Then he looked into her pale, grey eyes. He didn't grab her in a passionate embrace. He didn't offer a flowery declaration of love. He dropped to his knees right there in the blood, and Ruin wrapped his arms around her waist and pressed his face into her stomach. "You saved my life," he whispered, his voice cracking. Tess placed her hand on his dark hair, her fingers tangling in the damp strands. "I protect my investments, and you, my king, are a very demanding investment." Winter hit Ethelgard 3 days later. A massive blizzard buried the lower city in 4 feet of snow, locking the fortress away from the rest of the world. In the Great Hall, the blood had been scrubbed from the flagstones. New lords had been appointed to the southern territories, men chosen by Torin for their loyalty and vetted by Tess for their mathematical competency. A raven arrived from Dunlock. Tess sat by the roaring fire in the royal solar, breaking the waxed seal on the parchment. Torin sat across from her, sharpening a hunting knife, watching her with a quiet, intense devotion. "What does your sister want?" Torin asked, not looking up from the whetstone. Tess scanned the letter. "Alistister sends his congratulations on surviving the rebellion. Tamson sends a request. They want lower taxes on their iron mines this spring, citing the harsh winter as a burden on their labor force." Torin scoffed the sound, dark and amused. "Alistister is a coward, and Tamson is a vulture. Tell them I am doubling their taxes to pay for the floor they forced me to replace." Tess picked up a quill and dipped it in a pot of dark ink. "No, that's emotional. It's bad policy." She began to write, her handwriting neat and merciless. "I am denying their request. I am informing them that their iron quota remains exactly the same, and I am reminding Tamson that if she attempts to hide her yields again, I will send you to Dunlock to collect it personally. Not as a king, but as a tax collector." Torin chuckled, a deep, warm sound that filled the room. He set the knife down and walked over to her chair. He leaned down, resting his chin on the top of her head. "They thought you were broken," Torin murmured, wrapping his arms around her shoulders. "They thought a wolf without a shift was a dead weight." Tess blew on the ink to dry it. She looked at the crackling fire. She didn't feel broken anymore. She didn't need to run on 4 legs through the pine forests to understand power. Power wasn't just fangs and claws. Power was knowing exactly where to apply pressure to make the world bend to your will. "I am a dead weight, Torin," Tess said softly, leaning her head back against his chest, feeling the steady, massive thud of his heart. "I am the stone that breaks the blade. I am the gravity." Torin turned her face up to his. He kissed her. It wasn't gentle. It was a claiming, deep and heavy a promise written in breath and heat. When he pulled back, his amber eyes were shining. "You are the queen of winter, Tess, and I pity any fool who forgets it." Tess folded the parchment, sealed it with the heavy black wax of the Alpha King, and smiled. It was a cold, pragmatic smile. The smile of a woman who had finally balanced the ledger of her life. Did Tess's brilliant pragmatism and cold, calculating revenge leave you breathless? He claimed her twin sister just for power. The next morning the Alpha King claimed her for love is a testament that true strength isn't always about fangs and fur, Sometimes it's about holding the knife and balancing the ledger. If you loved watching this defective wolf rise to become the untouchable Queen of Winter, hit that like button right now. Don't forget to share this story with your fellow fantasy romance fans, and subscribe to the channel for more deeply human-grounded werewolf dramas every single week. See you next time.